Hi everybody, Dave Noel here for codesquid.ca. Welcome to another exciting tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at CSS Grid. I'll give you a simple starting point and what you can use it for, and I'll take you through the absolute basics of CSS Grid and how to make it responsive. I'll also introduce you to some handy time-saving tricks and some online tools that you can use for free to get up and running right away. So let's take a look at what we're going to be coding. I mocked up this simple store page full of products that everyone would like to buy. In here you can see we have a few different products with different layouts. We have a 3-up and a 2-up. The 3-up has sort of columns of equal size, even though you have different sizes of content within these columns, which is kind of cool. And the 2-up actually has alternating image sides. So we'll see how we can do that quickly and easily with CSS Grid. I've taken the liberty of cutting up all of these images and storing them as JPEGs and PNGs, and I threw them online. One thing that you're going to want to see though, let's have a look here. Go to a website called TinyPing, and you're presented with this thing. Now this, for whatever reason, is actually a better compression algorithm than Photoshop. So whenever you can, if you need to optimize a bunch of images, you can just throw them on here and it'll optimize them really nicely. Often many times better than Adobe Photoshop when you save it for web. Now the cool thing about this is, from what I can tell, the compressions are lossless. You don't really notice too much of a difference between compressions. So for instance, the big man photo that we have here is 1.4 megs, you can see here, but when we compress it, it'll actually bring it down substantially. Look at that, we saved 70%. So we can actually download this image and then put it up online wherever we see fit, and then use that in our project. Remember, optimization is a key to running sort of a jank-free and quickly loading web page. So you want to optimize your images as much as possible. I recommend using a utility like this because literally the artifacting on this is minimal, but for some reason they're able to save like scads of file size. So let's get back into the coding. All right, so we're going to take a look at how to code this page. We can see that our offers are quite extraordinary, so that's going to be like an H1 tag, and then we have this group of 3 columns, and each one kind of has the exact same format. You have an image, a title, content, and then a Buy Now button. You can see the Buy Now button sticks to the bottom of the thing, and everything has like rounded corners and drop shadows and all that kind of stuff. It looks very fancy and pretty. It's also constrained. I'd say the website itself it says it's 1920, but we're constraining it to 1400 pixels. So if your web page goes beyond 1400 pixels, we want to lock it to this size so that your sizes don't go all crazy, or your text doesn't reflow into this really long line that nobody can read. It's always good to sort of figure out how to constrain portions of your site this way for readability purposes as monitor sizes increase. So let's get into the code. How are we going to do these items, and how is this whole layout going to work with Grid? Right off the bat, I'm going to use something called Emmet.io. It's basically a way of shortening the way you code in a way that's sort of a lot more efficient once you get used to the syntax. But it burps out really nicely indented and closed tags, so you can actually work with it a lot better once you actually build the structure of your website using it. So for starters, we're going to start off with a div with an ID of page wrap. Emmet.io actually uses CSS selectors when creating things, so it knows that this thing here says this is an ID, and it'll create a div with an ID of page wrap. So then we get into, I guess we want an H1 tag, so we'll put in H1, and then things in curly braces you can just throw in. So we're just going to throw in lorem for now. Then we want our 3-up list. So generally what I do, it doesn't matter what you call these things. Generally what I do is I just give it a simple name like grid, so that I can specify all of my grid parameters, and then I give it a secondary class name of like 3 up, and then it'll work out nicely. So we say div grid and then 3 up, and then within there we're going to have div item, and then in the item we're going to have an image and a title. We'll say an h3 tag for an item title. Throw a little lorem in there, and we'll have our description, so that'll be a p tag, lorem, and we can follow it up with an href of pound. And we'll call this button. Now the cool thing about writing it this way is you can do iterative things as well. Since we know that the format is going to be the same for all the items, we can just times the items by 3. So that when I burp this out, it'll come up with a really nice, fully formed set of 3. And everything that we need is in there. Okay? Now the cool thing is, let's just separate this out and have a look at how this is actually constructed. So when you're working with grid, you need something called a grid container. It can be called anything you want in the class names, but this is going to be your grid container. So you put your display grid on this, and then it treats all of the first level children within this grid as grid items. So I just call them item for the sake of simplicity in the CSS. And you can see we have item, 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 and then everything within these items is just going to be a straight block level element unless we specify otherwise. So there is no bubbling down, or there is no sort of global grid attribute. The grid only applies to the items directly inside it. If there's anything in those items, it reverts it back to a block level element until you say, oh, make all your items grids as well. This will come in handy later when we're doing the 2-up. So let's go over to the CSS, and I guess we'll start writing some code. Now, right off the bat, what we want to do is we want to say the box sizing is going to be border box, because border box makes sure that if you put any padding on an element, it's not going to add to the width of that element. If you specify a width for an element, it stays, all the padding and stuff stays confined within that element. So it's just a handy way of producing CSS that gives you a predictable outcome. Some browsers like IE have box sizing set to border box by default, but in general, Mozilla and Chrome, they have it set to something else. So you end up with like unpredictable results if you don't set it to border box right out of the gate. Just to make things pretty, let's make our body and our HTML. We'll just set that up with a font family of Arial so it looks nice. We can set our initial font size to 22, and then all of the fonts from that point on are going to be based on this initial root font size. Set your margin to 0, padding to 0, and the default color of the text on the page is going to be 707070, just because that's what it matches. This is 7070. If you look here and look here, that's what it matches. By the way, this is Adobe XD. It's actually a pretty good prototyping utility, so I recommend picking it up and poking around with it if you're a designer. It's a lot better than Photoshop for laying out items. It's almost like InDesign, but specifically geared toward web. The cool thing is you can flag things for export. So as a developer going in here, I can name whatever it is I want to export. See this, product 4. If I want to export that, I just flag it for export, and then I go under File and say Export, and it does it really nicely for me, packages it up in all the resolutions that I'd need, and it'll even export PNGs, JPEGs, GIFs, and SVGs. So it's really handy to have, especially the SVG option. Okay, so this is already starting to look kind of nice. So let's get back in here, and we'll say we want to set up our H tags. Just set up the styling for our H tags. Now our H tags, the font size is going to be based again on the root font size. So it's going to be 2.2 EM. So that's 2.2 times larger than 22 pixels. So we end up with this really nice thing here. I think it works out to like 48 pixels or something like that. For H3, it's 1.3. So that's this. And then we get down to the paragraph sizes. Okay, let's set up our page wrap constraints. So page wrap, we gave it a width of 100% and a max width of 1400 pixels, so it never goes right to the side unless the page is 1400 pixels wide, in which case it just sticks to the side and then can get smaller from there. We set the margin to 0 and auto, so 0 on the top and bottom and auto on the sides, right? So that means that it'll always be centered. We want the text align to be centered just by default, and then we can specify what we want for the individual items later. And the background is EB, which is a nice light gray, and the padding around it is 40, so that when we get down to smaller mobile sizes or smaller than 1400 pixels, things don't go right to the edge. We actually have a little breathing room on the sides. Let's format the buttons. Oh, we didn't actually put in over here, we didn't put in any text for the button, so let's go ahead and do that. So button, and then we can say, just like we did over here with the lorem, we can say the curly brace, and we can say buy now. And then render. There, now you can see we have the buy now as a part of the buttons. Let's go ahead and create the styling for the button. Look at that, looks really nice. Let's go back to our original design. Yep, we wanted it. Okay, so basically, you can set, if you didn't know this already, you can set A tags as block level elements if you want to. In this case, I'm setting it as an inline flex element. Inline, so it follows the default styling of text align center. So when you make things inline, you can do that. And then flex, because I want it to recognize the height and then put it in the middle, just like you would do in a table cell, like a vertical align, only we're not using table cells, we're using a flex element, so then you can say align items center, and that makes it centered for all intents and purposes. Then you can add padding around the sides so that if your button has more text in it, like that, we can see that the button has a consistent look. It still has the 2M spacing around the sides of it, but it's still only going to be 50 pixels high. All right, let's get rid of this, make it consistent. Okay, and moving on, let's set up the grid element. So I'm going to be defining what the actual grid element looks like in CSS. So you can see I'm doing a display grid, and I'm giving it a grid gap of 20. That means that every element inside is going to have a gap of 20 pixels around them. I'm also giving it a margin of 30 and 0, which means no margins on the sides, but 30 on the top and bottom, just to keep it spaced out from your title part up here. That's just the general one. So now let's have a look at this part of the grid, the 3 up. So now we can say anything that has 3 up, we've already formatted it. See, it's pretty cool. Anything that has three up, we can say grid template columns, and this sets up the grid template for the columns. And it's 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. Now FR is a new unit, it's called a fraction unit, right? So you can say 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, which means each one takes up the same amount of space. Now if you say 2 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, then this one takes up twice the amount of space as these do. So if you take 2 of these and put them into here, you'll see that it takes up the same amount of space. We'll go ahead and we'll set up the item CSS. Okay, now you can see it a lot easier. The item CSS, I'm just giving it a position of relative because I want to put some absolute positioning for the buttons and stuff. I'll get into the reason why later. Border radius is 10% or 10 pixels because we want them to be kind of rounded. We have a padding of 40 because we want to have some nice spacing around the text so that it doesn't look like it's butting up against. It's a nice white space trick. And we're going to give it a box shadow of 10 and 20 and RGBA. RGBA is a really cool color space. Instead of using hex like hashtag, you know, EB, we would use something like RGBA. So 0 is 0 value for red, 0 value for green, 0 value for blue. That makes it black. And then you say 0.2, and that makes this sort of nice, mostly transparent box shadow. Now, if we put it all the way up to 9, it would be really dark. See? So you just want it kind of subtle for stuff like this. When you get monitors with slightly better gamut resolutions, you want to keep your grays a little more subtle. The color gamuts on lower quality monitors probably wouldn't even pick up this EB color. You want to sort of go with the best quality things for sort of subtle design like this, because if you go with the bare bones crappy SVGA monitors or VGA monitors, they don't have as broad a color spectrum. So when you design to that, oftentimes the colors look great on the worst monitors, but on the best monitors, everything looks either oversaturated or way too dark. So you want to cater to the higher end systems, unfortunately. That's just a neat little rule of thumb. So let's make this back to 1FR. And we have all our columns the same size again. You could even do it here, like make the middle one twice as wide, right? You can see right away how this would be handy for main page layouts, right? Like you can make this 6 times as wide as these guys, and then this would be your side nav, and this would be a place for ads, and this could be your whole page structure here. So that's how easy it is to set up sort of page layouts for Grid. But right now we're just going to do normal columns. We should put in the content now so that we can start formatting all of the elements and stuff properly. I'll just copy and paste all of my copy and images into here. There we go. Now we can see what everything looks like in place. We can see that there's a lot of variation depending on how high the content is. It really shifts these buttons around, and it doesn't look as clean as the initial layout where everything's nice and lined up at the bottom. So let's try, first of all, limiting the size of these images. Right now they're at 100%. You can see this one's a little janky and these ones are kind of nice, but if we bring them all down in size a little bit, and since we have 2 grid sizes on the page, let's put a little context on the images that we're trying to size specifically. So in this case, we're saying 3 up image, and we want to make them no wider than 120 pixels. And that makes it line up really nicely. We're getting close. Let's look at the buttons. Since we've already said a position relative on the item, now we can make anything inside these items a position of absolute and have it all work out quite nicely. We can see now the buttons are all lined up really nicely along the bottom, and we can put in or take out, let's have a look here. We can take out some text if we want to, and everything shifts and looks really nice accordingly. Now the cool thing is all of these columns, all of these items are relative to each other regarding their height. So if we have another row of items that comes up, it's going to be the tallest one in that row sets the height for the row. If we get rid of all of this, this is what the next row would look like. There. So we wouldn't end up with these awkward spaces and stuff. That's how Grid is a lot like table. Let's put in our text for the H1 just so we get a good idea of what we're looking at here. There we go. Okay. How does that stack up? Stacks up pretty good. This is a little weird. So why don't we say our H1 tag, margin bottom. There. A little better. I don't think we're looking at this at 100%. No, it's 80.5%. So let's zoom up so we can get a good one-to-one. There we go. Yep, okay, we're looking good. So this is a good sort of example of what a 3-up column looks like and how sort of Grid functions this way. Now, one thing that we'd want to do, let's have a look at how a 2-up column would run. We'll throw up the 2-up columns. Let's put in a little horizontal rule there. And we'll do our same little trick. We'll say div grid 2 up. And then how are these things formatted? It looks like we have 2 sides. So we'll contain everything in an item. And then, like I said before, then we'll say the item is the grid. Okay? So we'll say 2 sides in image. And I guess we'll call that an H3. It looks a little bigger. Then this is a P tag. Then we have to set up like a price section and a stock section, a button, and whatever medium it was the artwork is worked on. So let's have a look here. we want to do item, div, item, and since there's two of them, we'll say ×2, and then we'll get into the item and we'll set up an image side, div, image, and we'll set up a text side, div, text. Okay, so now you can see we have an image side and a text side. So in the text side, we have an h3 tag, and we'll just give that a lorem and a p tag. Okay, and then we have a p as well, but it'll have a class of price, and we'll say stock. It's so close to the price, we might as well make it just a span underneath so we don't end up with any size styling issues. Span, we'll call it stock. And then we have the buy now, and then this, the medium. So we have plus a button href equals, just like the other ones. And we want to say plus, I guess, p. And let's copy and paste this. Now let's render it out. So now we can see, oh, look, it looks really terrible. For the image side, let's have a look at some interesting ways of handling the images. So generally, because of how this is, you can see it goes right to the edge. This whole image side is just going to be a background image. And I'll show you an interesting way to get around SEO and screen readers for accessibility so that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can use sort of background cover to make sure that the image fills this whole side so it looks nice and uniform depending on what you have in there. And at the same time, it'll also allow you to put alt tags and stuff in here in case somebody's using a screen reader. All right, so we have here, and we'll just put in a background for the image, a product for, and then what we'll do is we'll throw in the actual image, and this is going to look really janky for a second, but I haven't put any styling on it yet. We put in the actual image, and now you can see, boom, actual image, and then, you know, your lorem ipsum, blah, blah, blah. Let's copy and paste the text as well. Okay, starting to look a little better, not much, but we're getting there. So let's do the same for the other one. Okay, so we have the image as a background and put in as an image. Don't worry about doubling up your images. If your browser has caching, most browsers do, it'll load the image once and then draw from that file twice. So don't worry about that. So now let's code what this thing is supposed to look like. I'll take you through it. So right off the bat, we want to say toUp item is display grid. Okay? Now the reason why we're doing that is because we want to make sure this text is one direct descendant of the item grid, and the image is another direct descendant, and you only have two in there, so there you go. You can see that the images are getting really crazy and big for no apparent reason. I've also put in a border radius of 10 to make it match these. It wasn't over here, but I did it anyway. So that's the image side, and we'll also set up how we want the actual image to render within the image side. We'll just do that. And then over here, you can see I did the same thing with the Buy Now button for this whole section down here, because we know that all of this stuff is only going to be on one line. So I set everything up to be position absolute, and I put a lot of padding at the bottom, padding bottom, for the toUp image text, so that regardless of how much content you have here, it'll keep pushing it down once it reaches that padding part. So everything else is going to sort of sitting on the padding. We can see that if we do this. The yellow portion is the padding for this particular box. Aside from that, I think we're just about done for setting up your initial grid. What I did for the second item here, if you say toUp item nth child even, that means every second item, you can actually say, hey, swap the grid columns. So you have for the image, put it on grid column 2, so column 1, column 2. We put the image on column 2, and then you can say for the actual item text, put it in grid column 1. Now here's where you end up with like some of the weird stuff going on. If you throw in If you don't specify the grid row you want this to be on, it's just gonna bump it down and put it into column 1. So you have to say, well, it was in column 2, but we want to put it on column 1 next to the image, and now it renders properly. So now if we put in one more, so let's do that. We can see left, right, left. See, it'll keep doing that all the way down. For every item that you add, it'll keep changing the size, or changing the side of the image. So that's really handy if you want to have like a varied layout, but a consistent DOM, especially if you're doing like work for templates and stuff, like for WordPress or any kind of CMS. You want to have like a consistent DOM, but you want to have some variation to the layout. This is how you would do it with Grid. You can just specify every second one, or every third one, or every fourth one, or heck, you could even say treat the very first one a little different, right? So you could say to up item nth child 1, and then we can say, why don't we just make this a block? So display block instead of grid, right? And now the very first entry is going to be a great big sort of hero image, and then you have this thing down here, your stuff, and then you still end up with this same kind of formatting. Then this one is even, then this one's odd, and it keeps going back and forth like that. So this is really handy if you want to do like some sort of varied thing for blog posts. You actually, if you're doing like a WordPress site or some kind of CMS blog, you can still have a really consistent DOM and have a vast amount of variance for your layouts. You don't have to do anything fancy with the way you're bringing stuff in from the database. You can do it all in CSS Grid. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to take all of these ideas and stuff and then convert it to a responsive layout. Okay? I'll catch you again on the next video.